Hi, I'm Melissa Chan.
And I'm Videsh Banerjee.
And this is News Desk. This week, we will be looking at what's been developing in Bangladesh over the past few weeks. We've seen many young protesters out in the street, and in response, a bloody government crackdown.
Sniper photographer of Goyle.
It's never a good thing when the government turns its guns on its own people. So, together with your contributions, hopefully after the discussion we have today, we all come away with a better sense of what brought us to this point and perhaps what might happen next in Bangladesh.
Exactly. And I'll be waiting out for your comments, questions and observations that you can post in the community chat that you all should be seeing in on your screens right now. And those questions, comments, observations, complaints, I'll try and bring into the discussion that we are going to be having and also be putting them to the guests whom you'll be hearing from shortly.
Yeah, and our guiding principle, our North Star question is going to be, can Bangladesh's students force real change? And
helping us to answer that question around the table, we are joined by Binish Javed. Many of you will recognize her from her continuous coverage of the situation in Bangladesh over the past couple of weeks. To her right is Arafat Ahmed. You're a student in Berlin. And if I got this correctly, you know a few people who might have been either injured or killed in these protests in Bangladesh. We'll talk about that in a moment. News desk veteran Amyan Asif is with us. And Amyan, you're going to be particularly helping us to understand the wider international response, or the lack of it, to these protests, amongst other things. Pablo Foley alias, who is also a news desk veteran, will be in the chat with you guys, talking to you all, taking your questions, interacting with you. Another person you will not see today is Dustin Hemmerlein, who is making this entire conversation possible along with our technical crew. And that conversation has already gotten underway. I'm looking at the community chat at the moment, and it's very hard to keep up with the comments, but I did manage to fish a few out before we got underway, because we had the question up already. And here is a sample of something that we're already seeing in the chat, beginning with user at Atik Hassan, 9298, who is saying, and I quote, "Save Bangladeshi students, PM Sheikh Hasina must step down." Then there's another comment by at Pets Nature Love, who is saying, "This is not a quota issue where a third party is playing with the Bangladesh government and trying to destabilize Bangladesh." That mention of third party will come up again in our conversation. Then we will try and get to the bottom of where that is coming from and what that means. And one last comment I just want to bring to the table here from Hussein Abdullah 9494, who is saying, "We want peace and justice, end to tyranny."
Yeah, and later we will be joined by Michael Kugelman in Washington, D.C. He is with the Wilson Center, and he'll provide some bigger picture analysis.
So send us your questions and comments in the chat that is already very active. Thank you so much for contributing to this discussion. And while we wait for more comments dropping into this chat, we also have a poll question that you can get busy with, that you can answer. And to help us understand what that poll question is, Amyan Asif has some pointers for you.
Right. We came up with a poll question like we do every week. This time we want to know we want your opinion on how accountability should be determined for the student deaths. So low estimates are 200 deaths of students, and the idea is that somebody should be held accountable for this. People don't die and nobody's held accountable anywhere in the world. So we came up with a few options that we thought represented some of the options that are out there. There's the one that the government has already proposed, which is a government-led probe. They said it was going to be independent, but it would be commissioned by the government. We have the option of a UN-led inquiry. A lot of people in Bangladesh are calling for the UN to step in and to give an authentically independent audit or probe, an inquiry into what happened and why 200, mostly students, have died in these protests. The other option would be, of course, new elections. That's a major demand of a lot of protesters in Bangladesh right now. And the last one is the pessimistic option. There will be no accountability. Some people I've already seen in the comments have pointed out that they want a combination of these things. They want independent inquiry from an international party as well as new elections. They say that you can't have one without the other, which if you feel that way, pick the one you think best reflects your opinion, what the most needed option is, and then write us a comment about why you think a combination is more.
And while Eamon's been
necessary.
talking, this chat has really been blowing up with this one hashtag that really stands out from everything else, hashtag step down Hasina. And then there are also expanded comments to do with that, such as It's My Life, who is saying no political parties have asked for Hasina's resignation. The people of Bangladesh are calling for her resignation. And just one more comment just to bring it in. Inferno Mahinur saying, help us by forcing Hasina for stepping down and organize a new and actual election. So a bit of what you were saying there earlier. Amy.
And 3,654.75. It's going up as I speak, but that many people have already voted. This is great. Gives a real representative poll of our audience.
And it'll be hard to bring in comments from everybody, but we'll get the sentiment. So trust us on that.
And it's clear that a lot of people who are in the chat know Bangladesh very well, are from there. But we also, of course, want to acknowledge that there are those joining us who don't necessarily know this story very well. So I do want to start with Binish. Can you just, in simple terms, explain the basics of what's been going on?
Okay. So this student protest movement started weeks ago, and basically there were Bangladeshi students protesting against a government job quota that restricted 56% of the jobs. So they were reserved, and the bulk of it, 30%, was designated for families, relatives of war veterans, those who fought the 1971 independence war with Pakistan. And in June, a high court reinstated this. So this was not in place. A high court reinstated this quota system that triggered the protests. And then there was a crackdown by the Bangladeshi government, and that's very typical. That's a pattern. Whenever there is protests, usually the government of Sheikh Hasina tries to quell it. But this time the crackdown was turned really brutal because the students agitated. There are other factors. The pro-government student body also participated, in assaulting the students. Then not only the police, but also the Rapid Action Battalion, border guards, all of these forces were fighting, and then students were retaliating. And things got escalated and so bad that we have now more than 200 people killed in Bangladesh. Most of them are students. The country is very sad, and people are reeling. And when we were constantly reporting on it, and we received a lot of comments from Bangladeshi students also who are overseas. And Arafat Ahmed actually is one of the students who sent me a long email, an emotional email about how he was being affected by what was happening in his country. So Arafat, very far away from home, how did you see the whole situation?
I felt helpless. I felt guilty. I felt helpless. I felt like my people, my family were struggling, and I am here at peace with no trouble. And for the longest time, I thought that I wouldn't have to go through something like this, because in Bangladesh, there was a sense of settlement within the people that we're just going to get by. We're going to be okay with everything. And then this happened, and then the government also cut off internet and telecommunication for a week.
For the entire country.
For the entire country, exactly. And this is unprecedented. I don't think this happens anywhere else in the entire world.
Not many countries.
Not many countries.
Maybe North Korea. It's not a good comparison.
Yeah. A lot of people, a lot of my friends were calling it a discount, Bangladesh, calling Bangladesh a discount North Korea. So during that time, it was just heartbreaking, and I felt helpless. And then that's when I tried to reach out to BBC, Reuters, any email, anything that I could find. I was emailing everyone and anyone with information, with cries for help, whatever I could do.
We're so glad that you reached out to us. Can I just ask you, maybe it's just too early to ask, but I'll ask it anyway. I mean, we've seen brutal violence, and we have clips, and we're going to be playing that. Binish, you helped verify some of those clips. Security forces opening fire on protesters. Could you imagine that those charged with protecting Bangladeshi citizens would be attacking their citizens in this fashion? I mean, this is an example of Abu Saeed, who's a student who got shot on the 16th of July.
Yeah. So I already shared so in my long email that I wrote to Binish, I wrote that I was part of the road safety protests in 2018, which was also covered internationally. So in 2018, I was just 18 years old. I was in college. And during that time, all the school students, so kids that are 8, 9, 10, 12 years old, all of us were protesting in the roads. There was a complete shutdown of all roads in Dhaka and all over Bangladesh in 2018. And in 2018 as well, there were incidents like this, not as brutal as this, but there were incidents like this.
And you're watching video right now of
Yes.
of one of the students getting shot.
Yes. It's a hard watch. Everyone can attest to that these are hard videos
And there's
to
a
watch.
lot of video evidence, and we are in a different age from 2018, the age of smartphones.
Yeah.
A lot of evidence is being accumulated.
Yes, and it's not only Arafat that contacted me. My Facebook page is full of messages of people who have sent me videos from Bangladesh, where we see police brutality very publicly, openly, on the streets. People are filming. And for me, this is like, it almost looks like unbelievable scenes. And this video that we were showing, Abu Saeed was the first student that was killed, and he became kind of like an iconic figure, if you would correct me, Arafat. He kind of became like a face of the student protest movement, and his killing, Abu Saeed's killing, that was televised, that people saw that he was unarmed, and that police was firing these gunshots at him, and then, you know, his friends and protesters took him to the hospital, and then he also was pronounced dead before he even reached the hospital. And that triggered a chain reaction, because we also spoke to a mother, and who said that she lost her only child, and in her interview she says that just one day before, he was showing this video of Abu Saeed to his mother, and she said, look what is happening to the students. And he was motivated, and there were so many people who Abu Saeed kind of like his killing triggered a lot of emotion among other students as well. And actually, if we can we can talk about that student, Rahat Hussain. He was 18-year-old, and he in Dhaka on 18th July, his mother claims that he was killed by Bangladeshi security personnel. He was protesting. If we can see those images, we actually have pictures of him when he was at the protest, and just moments before the protests, like this picture, we can see that he is Rahat Hussain. He's protesting in Dhaka. Shopna is mother who has lost her only child.
How old was Rahat?
He was 18-year-old. And his mother, this is his college ID card, and his mother in the interview said that they were planning, like they were saving money for his higher education. And what really stood out to me was that he was aware that coming from an unprivileged background, he will not have good prospects to get a job, and therefore that motivated many students, that they thought that this quota system was unfair, it was discriminatory, and was helping the ruling government party, and it really became a grassroots organic movement. And she also said that he had dreams. He really wanted to come and study in Germany. He knew all about Ausbildung. He already had found teacher
was looking into it and planning
into it, and the mother was arguing with him, it's so expensive, we don't have a lot of money, but he was adamant that I might have a future. And the mother very categorically, because a lot of people in Bangladesh are very scared right now. So they are hiding their identity. They are not speaking to media. They are scared. There are raids being done right now as we speak. This is what students, many people on our comments are writing, that they are scared. And this mother, because our camera person asked her that should we hide your face, and she said, now I have nothing to lose. I am not scared of anyone. I will show my face and I will speak publicly. And she gives a statement, and she, according to her, her son was, according to her, murdered.
Should we just listen to what she...
Yes.
We have a clip of it. I mean, if I'm not wrong, maybe we can play that soundbite from Rahat's mother, if we have it.
My son was murdered. How can it ever be compensated? And he wasn't murdered by civilians. He wasn't murdered by a random bullet or ammunition. The murder was committed by law enforcement officers under government orders. And my son was killed by a bullet that was bought with my tax money. What more can I say? I have no words.
Yeah, so that was the mother, and she blamed law enforcement. If you're just joining us, we are examining whether Bangladesh's students can force real change given what's happened over the last few weeks and then the bloody government crackdown. I do want to share some comments from the government. Because this is, and I'm sure it's going to infuriate Arafat and others who are listening in on the chat. But I do think it's important to hear what the government has to say about what's been happening.
There's a third-party infiltration involvement into this, and the third party being the BNP and Jamaat and Shibir, the Islamic radicals who are actually carrying out some of the destructions and the violence. And very unfortunately, of course, some people got stuck into the situation, and we saw the casualties. Therefore, the government has declared to form, and actually has been already formed, a judicial inquiry committee, and that is going to be independently, thoroughly investigate everything, each one of the casualties, and then bring the perpetrators or the responsible people to book. That is our commitment.
So two things strike me whenever I hear government officials talk about this kind of thing. Number one is that they're going to investigate it. How can you investigate it independently when the government is purportedly the culprit? The second thing is, the fact that they mention a third party. We see this, I mean, it doesn't matter what country. This is a universal thing, right? It doesn't matter what country a protest is happening in. Whenever there are young people, student protesters, there is a tendency for the authorities to blame third parties, mysterious parties, foreign intervention. This is from the autocratic playbook. So, Arafat, you just heard what the information minister said. What is your response?
This is not the first time that they're saying this. They said the same thing in 2018 as well. In 2018, they said, again, Jamaat, Shibir, BNP got intruded upon the whole protest, and they ruined the student movement, and that's why the government had to step in. We cannot just accept it because our government has been in power for 15 years now. So when a government is in power for 15 years, you start thinking that where is the opposition? Because they are talking about the opposition. BNP is the main opposition of Bangladesh Awami League. But BNP is the common emotion or the common thought in our country is BNP is non-existent. Like, they are not relevant anymore, to say it in modern terms, because that party's chairperson, Begum Khaleda Zia, she's severely sick, and her son is in exile, living in London. So, yeah, if they blame, that's just an easy way out for them. They do it, and they think they can get away with it.
But then what are they trying to do? I mean, if they're blaming Islamist radicals, as they're calling them, this is referring to the Jamaat-e-Islami, which is a known Islamist party. It's been banned, I think, today, if I'm not wrong. It was an executive order. And then their student wing. What is the government really trying to do exactly? Is it trying to discredit students, or is it trying to suggest something else?
I think they're just trying to justify their actions. They want to present to the international media, because in the international world, when you utter the words Islamic radicals, that they think they can just use that term in the international world to get away with it, to get away with their acts, their oppression of the student movement. And I don't think that even like, it's not benefiting the protest, it's not benefiting the government's cause as well, because they are being even more disconnected from the people. Like, one of my teachers told me that when someone stays in power for such a long time, they slowly start being disconnected from the general population. And comments like these, when it's a movement from the general population, when you make such comments, it just goes on to show how disconnected you are from the general population, from the students. And yeah.
Let me just bring in a few comments, because again the crescendo continues for asking for Sheikh Hasina, the Prime Minister, to step down. So that hashtag continues. Immediately after we played that soundbite of Mohammad Arafat, the Bangladeshi Information Minister, was talking about third-party involvement. There were people, and I cannot name check you guys because the comments are flying really thick and fast, addressing him as liar. Minister Arafat is a liar. But then there is also, just to dive down deeper into these calls for Sheikh Hasina to resign, people like Sajjad Habib, who are saying her stepping down is not enough. We need justice. She needs to be punished. And somebody is making an important point about the control of the security apparatus that was on the streets of Bangladesh trying to mind these protests. This is from Abir Hassan Ashik, who is saying that the Bangladesh Army, Police, BGB, that's the Bangladesh Border Guard, and all other national security communities are fully controlled, and important ranks recruited by the Sheikh Hasina. That means Hasina has control in every possible sector. That is a comment that Abir Hassan Ashik is making.
And that's something that I definitely want to pose to our expert, Michael Kugelman, in a few moments. But Arafat, you talked about the government responding the way they have, in part because they're thinking about the international community. And I do want to bring in Anmian at this point, because I know that you've been looking at the international response or lack thereof. What do you have for us?
That's right. I would actually bring in some comments first, just so we can set the stage here. Yeah. Mohammed said, why is the international community so silent about the situation in Bangladesh? Why haven't we seen any real actions yet, except for a few statements from the UN? Joel Rana says, if the international community remains inactive to restore democracy as well as human rights at the same time as now, it's not far from the future that Bangladesh will become the new North Korea or South Asia, basically implying that this could spiral into a worse and worse authoritarian situation if the international community doesn't act. So there are calls in our chat for the international community to have more of a forceful response, and that has struck me as well. I haven't been covering this story like Benish has, but I have been watching it from the newsroom, and it does strike me that there's very little attention for how grave the situation is there. I would like to bring in actually a quote here from, this is from the US. So this was one of the first responses. This was right when the protests started to turn violent. So this is Matthew Miller, U.S. State Department spokesperson, said, "We condemn any violence against peaceful protesters. We've been watching this matter very closely, both from our embassy and officials here in Washington. We've been monitoring the protests, have seen the reports of people dying, being killed in the protests." So this is a classic statement where it's he's basically saying, we're watching it, we're not condemning it, we're condemning generally violence against peaceful protesters, but he didn't say that there was violence against peaceful protesters. So it is a classic diplomatic move to stop short of condemning the government itself. The U.S. wants to remain close to the government of Bangladesh at this point.
So interpretation, lukewarm.
Right, that's my interpretation. I think if you had a beer with Matthew Miller afterwards, you would say that was exactly his intent, was to make sure not to go too far in condemning the government so that later they can escalate or maybe retract their statement if they decide that they don't want to get involved.
Interestingly, because we're talking about the United States, and maybe we can pick this up with Michael when he joins us, the United States has been very open about criticizing the state of democracy in Bangladesh. For example, the United States was very critical ahead of the general elections, which went uncontested. It was just Sheikh Hasina's government, it was just Sheikh Hasina's Awami League that fought the elections without the BNP, the Bangladesh National Party, because that boycotted the election. The US has also been openly critical about the state of human rights in the country. They banned the Rapid Action Battalion for human rights abuses in 2021. And just recently in May, they imposed sanctions on the former army chief of the Bangladesh army for serious corruption allegations. So it'll be interesting to get to the bottom of this, blowing hot, blowing cold.
I mean, one of the difficult things is the reality is the United States itself has been dealing with its own domestic news cycle in the last few weeks that I think has kept the government pretty busy.
Yeah,
we've seen the attempted assassination of a presidential candidate.
Yeah. But I think geopolitics is also at play here. So Sheikh Hasina enjoys strong support of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Both these countries have close bilateral trade and security ties. And both Sheikh Hasina and Narendra Modi have benefited from this cooperation. And I feel that for the United States, India, of course, is the most important ally in the Indo-Pacific, and therefore there is a very careful response from the US because it also doesn't want to completely damage the government of Sheikh Hasina. That, for India, is critically important. India, the current Indian government does not want BNP ever to come into the power. They have for security reasons and many other factors, they want Awami League. And therefore, we also see that among Bangladeshi people, there is a lot of criticism right now against India. And also in the region, I think that she does enjoy significant support from countries like China and countries like Russia. They are also investing a lot in Bangladesh.
And don't forget, going back to the U.S. statement, U.S.'s priority in that region is actually fighting Islamist extremism. So any ally that seems to represent stability in that area is going to get a pass on a lot of things. So the U.S., as does the EU and a lot of European countries that talk about human rights a lot, they have certain standards, but it's flexible depending on who you're allying with in order to fight forces that you think are even more of a threat to the region. So we've seen that in many countries in that part of the world. And I'll just bring in another quote from the EU, since I mentioned that. The EU very recently escalated a little bit with how they've portrayed the events there. This is Josep Borrell. He's the EU Commission Vice President. He's also the High Representative for Security and Foreign Policy. I conveyed my grave concern at the announcement of a shoot-on-sight policy and unlawful killings perpetrated in recent days by the authorities in Bangladesh. These acts must be thoroughly investigated and those responsible brought to justice. Also, they're stopping short of saying how they're going to be investigated. The government has already promised an investigation, so he might be saying that they should do that and remain independent. But yeah, he mentioned this shoot-on-sight. Maybe you can explain what that is.
And I think this, what the evidence suggests that this on-site policy was implemented.
It was.
Yeah, because there are videos circulating on social media.
But what is this shoot-on-sight policy? Because I don't think this is applied outside. I've not heard of this outside of South Asia. It's very unique to South Asia.
So a curfew was imposed probably on 19th July when the army was deployed, because the protests were getting out of control. The students had, so till around 19 July, students were successfully fighting the police and also the pro-government student body, Chitra League. And at that point, the military was deployed. And when military was deployed, curfew was imposed. And curfew means curfew, which means that if you leave the house during curfew hours, you will be killed.
That is what the shoot-on-sight means, basically. Instruction given to those in uniform. You see anybody on the streets beyond curfew hours, they can be shot.
They can be shot.
One place where outside of Asia, South Asia, where that has been in place is the death strip in the GDR. So this place between the two walls, if anybody passed into that place, they would be killed. And it was called a shoot-on-sight policy.
Very interesting.
No, it's interesting.
Sorry, go ahead.
It's interesting to call that it was the shoot-on-sight policy, but then here it's always in reference to whenever a curfew is on, not in any border area. That was like the border between the two Germanys at the time. But this is always, whenever it comes to curfews, you cannot be seen outside your home.
Yeah, I mean, since we're talking about the military, I think this is a great opportunity to bring in Michael Kugelman, who is joining us from Washington, D.C. Michael, thank you so much for coming on. He's with the Wilson Center, and we're really glad that you can speak to us, because I want to throw that question to you about the role of the military in all of this. Do you have a sense that they are all fully on board and comfortable with what has happened to their own citizens in the last few weeks? I asked this question, you know, my specialty is more East Asia and China. Essentially, what has happened in Bangladesh is that the government, in my eyes, Tiananmen'd their students in the same way that the Chinese government did in 1989. Internationally, and I also want you to comment on that as well, is we haven't seen the same reaction from the global community as what we saw in 1989. Why do you think that is? And also, of course, first question is regarding the military. Thanks again for joining us. That's a lot, I know, throwing your way.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa, and thanks to all of you for having me on. No, I think the question of the military in this story is a critical one that isn't being discussed enough. So kudos to you for bringing it up. You know, the military, there's a very interesting story here in Bangladesh's history. I mean, as you know, over Bangladesh's first few decades of existence, you had a very activist military in the sense that you had some coups, you had successful coups, you had unsuccessful coups, but in more recent years, and certainly over these 15 consecutive years that Sheikh Hasina has been leading the government, the military has been relatively quiet, and it supports Sheikh Hasina and it supports the Awami League. And you know, it is notable that she called in the military earlier this month to try to quell the protests, and it's the first time that she's done that over these 15 years, over these 15 straight years in power. But, you know, what does the military want? I mean, what is it looking for in Bangladesh? As in other countries, it's looking for stability and this internal stability. And yeah, I think that at this point in time, it sees that things are quieting down to an extent. We're still seeing protests in the streets, not as much as what we were having in earlier months. Things are quieting down, and I think that's reassuring for the army. And it doesn't feel a need to do anything that could be seen as going at odds or taking a different position from what Hasina and her government would like to do. There had been some reports when the protests were at their fever pitch and when you had the most unrest earlier this month, some reports that the military was uncomfortable with the idea of this shoot on sight measure, which you had mentioned before. There had also been some reports that, again, were not confirmed, but are still worth mentioning just to indicate that, these are things that had been talked about, that large numbers of junior officers were very unhappy with the current state of affairs. But where we are now is that the army is with Hasina, and that's critical for her. But I think the question is, moving forward, if you have another round or another phase of protests that turn violent again, and that certainly is a possibility, quite frankly, not necessarily now or in the next few weeks, but down the road, if things get really bad again, I think that there is that possibility, quite frankly. If the army concludes that the situation is so troubling and so unstable and so concerning that you could have, in that worst case scenario, the army suggesting to Hasina that she think about choosing a successor and stepping down. We are nowhere near that scenario now, but I don't think we can rule it out. But bottom line is that we have to remember that in previous years, earlier in Bangladesh's history, the military did play a much more active role in policy and politics than it does now.
Michael, and so on the international thing,
yeah, I just want to sort of bring in some aspects on about police brutality, because the chat is very active with comments about that, not just the police but also the army. Let's just start with the police. Ahad Opt is saying that the Bangladesh police has become a terror. They constantly harass students for no reason. Students are being forcibly detained. There's a specific comment about the army. This is from a user whose name I cannot read. My apologies, but he's saying, as a former cadet of the BNCC, I must say that it's really shameful for army personnel that they taught us about patriotism, but now they're standing against the people of Bangladesh or the whole country. But just to go back to the point that you were making, Michael, about the army batting for stability, so to speak, is it not the case that the army has also potentially benefited from Sheikh Hasina being in power? And I bring that up because it was only in May this year that the US sanctioned former Army Chief General Aziz Ahmed for, quote, significant corruption. So there is a quid pro quo here as well, isn't there? The army benefiting from Sheikh Hasina being in power?
Oh, absolutely. And there are close links between Sheikh Hasina and top military leaders, family links, quite frankly. So, there's this very interesting relationship right now. But yes, you're right.
Können Sie uns jetzt hören?
Oh, sorry.
Vielen Dank. War wohl bei uns ein Hardware-Problem?
Oh, no, we can hear whoever's speaking to Michael in control room. Let's bring Michael back on if he is still there.
I don't know what's going on. I don't know. There appears to be some technical issue.
Okay, right, we lost Michael.
But temporarily, we've been assured.
Temporarily, yes. Yes, he's going to rejoin us very, very shortly. But that is a big question, right?
But just on the point of the army, it is very interesting that there is this sort of a relationship, the close relationship that Michael was talking about, given that military officers were implicated for the assassination of Sheikh Hasina's father, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, in 1975. So I wonder if, as a Bangladeshi, Ahmed, how do you look at this, that you have a prime minister that is ordering the army to be on the streets against its own people, when the same army, not the same present army, but the same men in uniform took away her family from her in the past? I cannot put two and two together and understand this contradiction.
Well, to answer that question, we need to look into the history of Bangladesh in general. So, as Melissa very well pointed out, that it has been a bloody history when it comes to military of Bangladesh since independence, since 1971. There have been two military leaders in Bangladesh. One was the founder of Bangladesh Nationalist Party, Major Ziaur Rahman, and the other was Ershad. I don't know his ranking. I don't remember his ranking. Both of them were military leaders who became the leaders of Bangladesh government. And other than that, it has only been Sheikh Hasina or Khaleda Zia who were prime ministers, right? So whenever one government comes in power, they try to somehow embed themselves with the military, one way or the other, either through quid pro quo or any other means. But in the last 15 years of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's rule, it has become deeper in the sense that there are family links.
Arif, I want to ask you, other than the military, there are other elites in any system. Do you have a sense, I mean, this is something I don't know, but to what extent, for example, is the middle class unhappy about what has happened? What about the civil servants, civil society? Where do they stand? Because they might... Look, political power comes from the barrel of a gun. That is a quote from Mao Zedong. And so the military is a massive element in all of this. But there are other components within Bangladeshi society. Where do they stand?
Before you quickly answer that, just to sort of help you along, and I do apologize for this thing, because it just seems so apt, because we're getting a lot of comments about teachers who are also being arrested. You're talking about other elements of society.
Yes.
Zaheen is saying that our teachers are coming forward to save their innocent students. The police is laying hands on them too. Shariar Shakil saying university teachers and lawyers have come forward today and have faced the violence of the police. Muaz Mohyuddin saying, as of now, a lot of teachers who have supported the student movement are being arrested. So society does seem to be getting involved. And I'm really sorry to interrupt, but go ahead.
We also have visuals of there were teachers and lawyers that protested today, and they are seeking justice for the killings. And if we could also, we can see these are fresh visuals.
I think it's off Amyan's screen, right? If we can put his screen up whenever you are ready, Amyan.
And for me also, this is quite striking that after such a brutal crackdown, there's still a lot of people that are coming out on the streets even now.
Truly risking their lives, knowing the consequences.
Their lives and getting arrested. And so far, in just 2 weeks, Bangladesh has arrested around 10,000 people. And they were,
Yeah, as she very well pointed out. So this is one of the tactics that the government has been using in the past, that instead of shoot on sight, they would just arrest people, detain them for the unforeseeable future, and they would not present the detainees in front of court. And that's why you see the main 6 coordinators of the protest, they detained them unlawfully, put them in the detective branch's office, and then, funnily enough, they released photos of the detainees having food with the detective branch's head. And in the High Court, they speak about it. In the High Court, they say, do you think it's a joke that you detain them and then you release a photo and you think it's all okay? The court said that.
And maybe we can also just point out that while they were detained, a statement was released that we, the student protesters, we are giving up on our demands, because the main demand of the quota, the scaling back of quota, that we know that on 21st July, the Supreme Court scaled back drastically. The main demand was the government quota, from which the protest had started. So they released this video of the detained protesters, and many believe that it was under like duress and coercion. And it's not a centralized body, so there are other coordinators who are in hiding, and they say that they will continue to protest.
Yes.
And please.
One of the slogans of the protesters right now is, we're all coordinators. If you detain one, everyone else will become a coordinator.
That is a growing strategy among protest movements around the world, because they figured out that if you have clear leaders, then the authorities can go after you. But if it is a sort of a equalized or a sort of strategy of all protesters being equal, no one clear leader, it's much harder to stop a movement. We do have Michael Kugelman joining us. Sorry about the technical issues, Michael. We've just been talking about the other centers of potential power, what people beyond the military in Bangladesh think. I would love your thoughts. Does civil society, can they play a role? What do government officials, civil servants think? What about other professional elites? Can they effect change, or is this a situation where we see the government in lockstep, as you said, with the military, and it is quite a bleak situation in terms of the prospects for what the students and young people demand?
Well, one of the things that stands out about these protests compared to other mass movements that we've seen in Bangladesh over the last 15 years is that the level of public support that these had. I mean, we had, this is not the only large anti-government movement that we have had over the last 15 years. But what's quite striking is that after these protests turned violent, and they only turned violent really after the state unleashed force against the protesters, the level of solidarity that was expressed by so many in Bangladesh toward these protesters, many of whom, or most of whom, are young people, protesters, was really striking and quite remarkable. And quite frankly, I think that's a very concerning reality for the government. So, I would defer to your colleagues here and to those on the ground that are in touch with people across the spectrum in Bangladesh. In terms of my own conversations with contacts on the ground, I'm hearing a lot of just a lot of anger and a lot of unhappiness about how these protests played out because of how the government responded. We know that, unfortunately, the playbook of this government, whenever there have been peaceful protests in the past, is to crack down hard and blame the opposition, as they did in this case, even though these were not political protests, right? These were led by members of the public, by students. So I think that the fact that it was so much worse, though, this time around, and we're talking about, we don't know exactly how many people were killed, right? That's one of the issues. We don't know. Hopefully there'll be an investigation that we get that information. But we're talking, at the least, nearly 200 people that were killed, many of them by security forces. The anger is very palpable and understandable about that. But also the fact that you had this internet shutdown of nearly a week. The entire country was cut off from the world. In Bangladesh, people couldn't be in touch with family outside the country. Bangladeshis outside the country couldn't be in touch with family inside the country. Understandably, there'd be a tremendous amount of anger about this. My sense, though, is that the brunt of the anger has been directed at the government, at the civilian leadership, more so than it has been at the military. Not that there hasn't been anger directed at the military as well, but I think that if the major, most resounding images of the violence that played out, certainly the police, what the police were doing, the way in which they responded, the use of sound grenades, tear gas, so many things. I think that the police have really been receiving a brunt of the anger, along with the government leadership on the whole. But yes, this is not something that is going to just die away. This is not a crisis that can subside. And I think the government feels that because it basically saw the proximate cause of the protest addressed, the job quotas were dramatically curtailed, that they could move forward. But this is not, it's very difficult to return to how things were earlier.
Michael, I do want your views on the brutality that we are seeing and why we were seeing that brutality. But because we were talking about Bangladeshis living abroad, I would like to bring in a comment that has come in on our chat. This is from Muhammad Expatriate saying that Bangladeshis are calling for remittance shutdown all over the world. We want to squeeze money from this tyrant government. Do you think that this will put Hasina to consider stepping down? Do you think that something like this could happen? I mean, we're just talking about, there's what, 15 million Bangladeshis, I think, who live outside of Bangladesh. If this remittance as a source of income for the Bangladesh government were to shut down, as Muhammad Expatriate is asking, would this force Sheikh Hasina to step down?
Well, it would take a tremendous, it would take a lot to get her to step down. She, as you all know, she's someone that has really leveraged her traumatic, tragic past to really position herself as this strong, unrelenting leader. It would take a lot to get her to step down. Yeah, but that in theory, yes, that could be a very devastating move for the government because indeed, I mean, this is an economy that's reliant on remittances, and particularly now with the country experiencing levels of economic stress that it has not experienced for quite some time, despite all this talk about Bangladesh's economic growth story. But the problem with that, if Bangladeshi expatriates were to try to follow up on that, that could hurt the common person in Bangladesh as well.
Right.
That's always the risk when you try to do something like that. It may really may defeat the purpose of pulling that off, and the government could shield itself from the impacts of that, whereas the common people could suffer even more than they already are now from economic stress.
I just have one point that I'd like to pick up on. You talked about Sheikh Hasina's traumatic past, and you're referring to the assassination of her father and the rest of her family. I mean, the reason why she is alive is because she was outside the country when that attack happened on the 15th of August, 1975. Hopefully, I've got the date right. And the military was implicated in that. So you would imagine that Sheikh Hasina is somebody who understands what the use of force on family members can mean for the rest of the family. Yet you have the same Prime Minister issuing shoot-at-sight orders to the military some 30-odd years later, and you're seeing the kind of brutality that we're seeing on the streets of Bangladesh. How does one explain this?
I think that much of her politics is vendetta-driven, and I think that she's had this long-standing bitter rivalry with the head of the opposition party, Khalida Zia, who is very ill and not really involved in politics now. But I think that for Hasina, her politics are really driven by a sense of grievance that her opponents are out to get her, and that therefore she needs to do what needs to be done to deal with these threats. And we see this in terms of how she looks not only at the opposition but also at other countries, including the U.S., a partner. She had indirectly accused the U.S. government of trying to stage a regime change. She made this speech in Parliament last year, and her view is that things were so much worse when the other side, when the opposition was in power in terms of human rights violations and use of force and so on. So she's able to find a way to justify everything she does. And again, it goes back to what happened to her in the past, that it was her, and this is of course very true, it was her that was traumatized by that horrific act of violence where she lost much of her family when she was a young woman living abroad. But at the end of the day, quite frankly, this is autocratic behavior, right? I mean, if you justify egregious use of force, no matter what you do to justify it, it's very hard to justify that, so to speak. And I think that is really indications of this unfortunate slide that Bangladesh is experiencing toward autocracy and toward authoritarianism. And of course, that you could also bring in the broader context of how Sheikh Hasina has been able to stick around over the last 15 years straight through several elections that so many view as not free and not fair. And of course, the most recent election earlier this year, the opposition did not take part.
Michael, I mean, just going back, I mean, we have been talking about remittances. Thank you, Baresh, for bringing that up. I mean, that is the external force. I know the train kind of left the station a little bit earlier with my question about what the international community can do, but I think this is a great opportunity to bring that question back and pose that question to you, Michael. What do you think, first of all, do you find the U.S. response satisfactory? You are sitting in Washington, D.C. And second of all, beyond the United States, what do you think should be done?
Well, there's several factors here. First of all, it is notable that governments in the West have been relatively restrained in terms of how they've responded to this. I mean, looking at particularly egregious cases of violence here being undertaken by the state. First of all, just to be very practical about this, the world is on fire right now, right? I mean, particularly, Washington and governments in Europe and elsewhere, they're looking at what's happening in the Middle East, including what's just happened in the last 24 hours. And an internal crisis in Bangladesh, no matter how serious it is not going to register very high on the radars of many Western governments. The other issue is another practical one. That I think that Washington and other Western countries realize how dangerous and volatile the situation is in Bangladesh. And I think they don't want to say anything that could do anything to imperil the American citizens as well as American interests in Bangladesh. And, these protests, there were cases of violent protests playing out very near the U.S. Embassy facility in the diplomatic enclave. So I think that the U.S. wants to be very cautious. But what makes the U.S. stand out here is that, as you know, for some years, in the weeks leading up to Bangladesh's most recent election, U.S. officials were making a lot of noise about, the need for free and fair elections, a lot of public remarks about rights issues. But then the U.S. pretty much went silent, said a lot less, and that's continued since the election and so on. And I think that's in part because the U.S. wants to be careful not to do anything that could imperil its interest or its people there. Now, theoretically, there are things that could be done. Bangladesh is one of the only countries in South Asia that has been on the receiving end of U.S. sanctions over the last few years, other than the Taliban leadership in Afghanistan. The U.S. did sanction one of the major paramilitary forces in Bangladesh, the RAB, which has been involved in the crackdown over the last few weeks. So theoretically, the U.S. could, we can't rule out that placing new sanctions on some members of the security forces, can't rule that out. There had also been visa restrictions that the U.S. had imposed on individuals who had never been named for undermining the election process. We can't rule out visa restrictions imposed on those seen to have been involved in this violence. But at the same time, as I said before, the U.S. will need to be very cautious. There are potentially other points of leverage. Bangladesh, for example, has been trying to work with the EU governments to get more trade privileges in terms of GSP, things like that. Right. And I think that the Europeans know that they might be able to use that as leverage. So there are things that could be done, but it's a matter of how far are governments willing to go, given their very real concerns about the safety of their citizens and their interests inside Bangladesh.
Can I just ask you a very specific question, Michael, about the role that India plays here? Because the Indian Foreign Ministry did respond to what was happening in Bangladesh, but called it an internal matter for the country. It seems like a very tepid response, given this is happening with a country that India essentially helped liberate. Can you explain India's position here?
So, India looks at internal politics in Bangladesh very similarly to how the Awami League looks at it. India, like Bangladesh, views the opposition as a threat and as a dangerous Islamist threat. And, Indian officials say this very, very candidly, very publicly. So, India's government, and particularly Modi, like Sheikh Hasina, they see her as really the only solution, the only option for Bangladesh. And my view is that the Indian government will stay with Sheikh Hasina. They'll continue to support her, even if things pick up again and you have a return of the unrest. But at the same time, I think that New Delhi is really the only government that would have the capacity to be influential in getting through to Sheikh Hasina. If things get to a point down the road where it looks like it's better for her to step down. I mean, if India believes that her staying in power could become such a destabilizing risk for Bangladesh and by extension for India, that is where perhaps the Indian government could push her to step down, choose a successor from her party. But India does not want to go there. And indeed, it is quite striking just how much in lockstep the Indian government is with the Bangladeshi government. And you have to look at the relationship between the two leaders, Modi and Hasina. Ideologically, they're very similar in terms of how they look at a lot of issues, including the issue of Islamist politics, political Islam, and all of that. So, the Indian government, I think, is very simple. It's going to stay with Sheikh Hasina as long as it can. But when push comes to shove, it's really the only actor that would have the capacity to get through her. Even her small internal, her support system, the aides that she works with, even they would be unwilling to gently coax her to step down if things get really bad. The Indian government could actually get through if it wanted to.
It's interesting that you say that the Indian government could have a shot at this, but when it comes to the Chat community, a lot of people are placing their hopes on the UN, a UN-led investigation, such as this comment from Man in Power, who says, please pressure international community to stop army participation in UN missions. Tanisha Haq saying, UN and other country representatives are only expressing concerns. We need them to act and intervene. Saiken says, we want a UN-based inquiry. So a lot of hope being pinned there on the UN. Do you think the UN will deliver?
I think that the UN has a very specific reason to want to be involved in an investigation because there had been reports that UN-marked vehicles were involved in the crackdown. That's a really serious thing for the UN, for sure. And it obviously has implications for Bangladesh because it likes to talk about how it's such a major successful contributor to peacekeeping operations. Yeah, the messaging from the UN suggests that it would want to be involved in some way. But at the end of the day, I mean, as we know, the UN does important work, but usually the work it does, what it comes out with, it's all very non-binding. And I think that even if the Bangladesh government has suggested that it would support a UN role in an investigation, which is a bit surprising to me, but I think that's great if that's true. But again, there's only so much at the end of the day that that the UN would be able to do.
Michael, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. We know you have to get going, but thank you.
Thanks so much, Michael.
Thanks for having me. Take care, everyone.
So Michael said just a lot just now. I know Arafat and Binish, you guys have been listening in. Do you have any reactions to what he said?
I definitely have.
I know you were taking a lot of notes. So,
so I think the fact that the family history of Sheikh Hasina and her traumatic experience is something I think every person in Bangladesh knows, because she has really, very publicly expressed the trauma that she has gone through. And the mother that we had interviewed, the mother of Rahat Hussain, in one of the, she told DW that, so she was referring to the Prime Minister, that she is still seeking justice for her family. How can she not understand my pain? And how will I be compensated for that? So it's something that every person who has been affected right now is asking the Prime Minister, that she should understand the pain and trauma of losing your loved ones.
And we can actually, I think it's worth showing visually what this pain and trauma means, because I think we were looking at this website, weren't we, earlier, Amy? That is listing the names with faces of some of those who have been killed. Mostly these are students. I don't know if you can bring this up, but I think it's just worth showing that on the screen. Yeah, this is the website. It's from shohid.info. Just to be clear, I don't think we know who is behind this website, right?
We don't.
We don't really know.
But it seems fairly accurate.
It seems fairly accurate. I mean, a lot of international news agencies are quoting this website, and Bangladeshi journalists also say that it appears to be authentic and probably is run by a protester activist, but we don't know who is behind this.
So basically, it looks like a database of all of the activists who were killed in these protests, and it has a name for everyone. I think. And some of the photos are missing for some people, so they're marked with this
and they're
abstract
asking
picture.
public. They're asking public to
contribute.
Let me ask you, Arafat. You know somebody who perished in these protests. Is that person on this website?
Yes, one of the first persons named Mir Mugdho.
Where can we find him?
Do you know the number, or we can just search by his name?
It's this. Is this?
Yes, the fourth one.
Yeah, the number 9, right?
The fourth one. Yes.
Can you talk a bit about Mir Mugdho? What happened? What do we know? Where did he die? What happened? If you're okay to talk, you don't have
of course. Yeah, no. So I already told Binish about him. So he is the classmate. So he's studying masters. He's doing his MBA. So he's the classmate of one of my friends, university classmates. Right now, he was also protesting in 2018. He was part of the protest, just like I was. So I told you in the beginning that many of the protesters who protested in 2018 are protesting right now for the quota movement. He was distributing water bottles and biscuit packets to protesters. And while distributing, he got shot. there was a friend of him who was with him. Both of them together were distributing the water bottles and biscuits to the protesters. And all of a sudden, the police started cracking down on the protest, and they started running. And while the friend started running, suddenly he saw that his friend wasn't running with him. And he looked behind and he saw that his friend was lying dead on the ground, bleeding out. But he couldn't stop running, so he just kept on running. These trauma, these are collective traumas. These collective traumas are shared by every student. There's a video of him that shows that how he's calling out people. Does anyone need water? Does anyone need water? And he's distributing those waters. When you see that person and you learn that he was shot dead, that's gonna stay with everyone. And that's gonna affect the coming generations, because our generation is gonna get older, and our generations would want to get into the civil service jobs and get into, I don't know, run the government in the future. And these are gonna stay with us, and I don't know if I will ever be able to forget this whole situation. This is gonna stay with me forever. All this death of my fellow compatriots, if I may say, people my age, perishing. I could have very well been there. I know for a fact that if I was back in Bangladesh, I would be protesting right now.
We've asked you a lot about your experience, the experience of your friends. If you had a wish list of what you could do right now, what would you like to see happen?
So there's a 9-point wish list, if we may say, by all the students. One of the first demands is that our Prime Minister needs to take responsibility of this. And how can she show that she's taking responsibility? The people that are in charge, it was a failure on their part. So they need to resign. They need to step down. All the police commissioners, all the ministers, they need to step down. Then all the university professors, provosts, who were in charge, they were not able to protect the students in university grounds. That was a failure on their part. They also need to step down. All the students who were implicated and still now being arrested and being harassed, all these needs to go away right now. If the government just gives us the ability to speak our mind, to protest peacefully, then everything would be normal. Every single thing would be normal. People would protest if the government and its student wing didn't attack. Let's just hypothetically speak. 2nd of June, the High Court reinstates the quota, 56% quota. Students start protesting. There's a comment by the Prime Minister. The government is saying we twisted her words. Let's just take it as it is.
Tell that comment.
So, Prime Minister said that if I don't give quota to freedom fighters, should I give quota to Razakars? Razakar is
a very provocative
term.
Yeah,
it's a taboo term in Bangladesh. You don't say it out loud. It's a very heinous word. So,
but it refers to the paramilitary group that was fighting with the Pakistan military in 1971 and committing war crimes against the Bangladeshi population.
Even heinous than war crimes. So because of that, I don't think that was no one in this world, who is a political leader, I don't think would say that was a good thing to say in a national television when everyone's watching you. And when someone as powerful as the Prime Minister says something like that, that is bound to invoke some emotion within the people that are protesting. And protests in general are run with emotions. We students, we are young people, we want something to be done, and you could have just given it to us. Like you did it, you gave it to us in 2018, right? You come out saying that it's a judicial matter, it needs to be settled judicially. You say that, but in the second, like, the ruling came in on the 2nd of June. The Attorney General was directed on the 18th of July to get the ruling reversed. And then it got reversed on 21st of July. Right. There's a 1 month, 14-day gap. Why is there a 1 month, 14-day gap? The protests started getting very heated up on the 14th of July.
This could have been avoided.
This could have been very well been avoided.
And there is a sentiment that is also there on the chat to see, and this is about whether Bangladesh, your country, is democratic or not. And it's just worth bringing in at least two comments that I think is worth looking at. Kheral Islam Rakib, who's saying that, I'm going to read this out in full. Although we live in a free country, we have never experienced freedom. Every now and then, we have to accept the harassment of terrorist forces in the government and in the government. Jannat's Art is saying, I'll read this out in full again, we normal citizens are tagged as BNP or Jamaat, but we are citizens fighting for our rights. We are not the opposition party. Please help us to bring justice. Does that accurately describe the mood?
Definitely accurately described that. This is not the first time. I already expressed that the same thing happened in 2018. And that was a student movement run by even a younger generation, like 14, 12 years olds blocking the roads.
Right.
And even during that protest, they blocked the internet for a couple of days. So it just goes on to show how the government would look at any protest and be threatened by it somehow. I don't understand where this mentality comes from, because when you are in power for that long period of a time, why would you feel threatened by the general population?
Nonviolent, peaceful protest is a form of communication from the citizens to the government.
Exactly.
Are there viable political alternatives for the movement to get behind? Because when people are calling for Sheikh Hasina to step down, obviously it implies that they want a different person in power. Is there anybody there that would not be a worse alternative?
One of the terms that my teachers told me when I asked him, is there an alternative in 2018, he said, I'm quoting him, that this government is the lesser evil. That's his word. And that's why this government has been able to stay in power for this long. But when you have a government in power in such manner for this long, there will be some repercussions. And repercussions like these, when you try to protest, when you try to express your freedom of speech, you're going to be halted. You're going to be stopped on your tracks. And the people recognize this and they want a change. So there was a recent interview that I saw where Nobel laureate Dr. Yunus from Bangladesh, he is one of the most prominent figures from Bangladesh, internationally recognized.
And also persecuted by this government with a lot of cases.
Yes. And even the Prime Minister says very, very weird stuff about him, that he somehow stopped the International Monetary Fund, IMF, to stop investing in our national projects, you know, big projects like the Podda Bridge and etc., etc. So he said that, is there an external threat? Was there an external threat? Why was the military deployed? Was this necessary? He asks that, was another country's army invading our country? Then why was the military deployed?
From an international perspective, though, I'm curious because I know in the U.S. when there was the Black Lives Matter protests, also in Ukraine with Maidan, there is always a section of society, not always, but in the cases that I've seen, there's a section of society that wants stability over everything. And you said that the people want Sheikh Hasina to step down. A poll from a year ago said that 70% of Bangladeshi said that the Prime Minister was doing a good job. Do you feel like maybe that society is divided over this? Do you feel like there is this kind of group within Bangladeshi society who just wants the protests to go away and wants Sheikh Hasina to crack down on them, even using the military?
Right now, no general population feels that way, that the protests should go down. If, after seeing whatever we have seen already in this video, in the protests, I don't think anyone would feel that this government is doing a good job. And the way it is dealing with, especially I want to mention that law enforcement officers, there are corruption charges, huge, millions and billions of takas and dollars. Corruption charges are going on against former commissioner, IGP of Bangladesh Police. He did, there's a corruption charge against him, and all his assets were recently frozen this year. And then we talk about ex-army chief. Yeah. So, Melissa, you said that there are other facets of the general society, the government. When the general population sees that the people and the system and people who are in charge of the system, they see that these corruptions come in, there is already a huge level of distrust in the general population, that there's this thing that when you look at how large these corruption charges are against the government and former government officials, you can see how much the people of the country probably contributed to the economy, and what could have been, like, if there was no corruption, this could have all been used for progress.
I would argue that because there is no alternative political power, I think that's a big, huge problem that I can see. Coming from Pakistan, I can also see that why it can be such a big problem, because many people, I mean, I agree with your sentiment that people are angry, but then people are also very nervous what will happen, because with BNP there is a nervousness among population, because they're also not very comfortable that if BNP comes, and so a lot of people are also quiet. They don't know what to do, how to react in this situation.
You'll have a better idea on this, but just to sort of respond to that, I mean, the BNP has been out of power for 15 years. The BNP was something else 15 years ago, and the BNP since then has been facing continuous persecution. At least that's what a lot of Bangladeshis say. So you don't know what the BNP right now is. BNP needs a chance to govern, so maybe it is a different thing. But there is just one thing that I wanted to... I've not been able to evade it ever since these protests began, because we're looking at the images, and a lot of these images our viewers should know we cannot show you because of the kind of brutality of the visuals that we've been getting. All the visuals that you've seen so far, especially of students being attacked by security personnel, these are all verified, a lot of them verified by Binish and also by Amnesty International, just so people are aware of this. But there is something I did want to ask you, and what does not escape me is looking at young people on the streets of Bangladesh protesting against a government and against an order that they feel is unfair. And I always compare that in my head to the visuals from 1971 and the elections before that, when Mujibur Rahman, as a young man, was leading the independence movement of Bangladesh. that led to finally a brutal war and the birth of modern Bangladesh. And a lot of people forget that Bangladesh is a very young country. 1971, modern Bangladesh is created. Am I stretching things when I ask you, does this seem like a moment from 1971 in which young people took the destiny of their country in their hands, took their demands in their hands and created a country for themselves? Is this something similar?
Yeah, you can very well say that. Maybe it's not a straight out-and-out war, but it's a war-like situation. When there's curfew, when there's military deployed, it's a war-like situation. It's as simple as that. And when there are so many people, and mind you, local newspapers in like Bangladesh are estimating much higher numbers of death. Yeah. We say 200, but the number very well could be much, much higher.
Let's not forget injured. I mean,
yes,
some of these injuries are very serious.
Serious,
They're close to death.
Yes.
10,000.
There have been amputees,
Yes,
yeah.
and a lot. And another thing we must point out is that Bangladesh is, like, majority of the population are Muslims, right? So they would rather not admit the deceased and then they just take it and then bury them. So we can never officially find out that these people actually died. So that's the general commotion. Like the person that Beanish interviewed.
And also this has also been reported widely that the hospitals have not been giving reports to the families because they have to then write the reason of their deaths. Even Abu Said's family had to struggle for hours. His brother says that he was speaking to his Abu Said's dead body was basically vanished from the hospital because at that time in Raganpur is a city, the police felt that if they release the dead body, these protesters will take this dead body out and then the protests will be further triggered. So for hours, they just didn't know where the dead body was. So there's...
I mean, in the coming days and the weeks, and frankly years, the collection of evidence is going to be very difficult, and we're already seeing essentially what sounds a bit like a potential cover-up. Arafat, thank you so much for your contribution, and I think this is and Baresh, you've also brought in so many comments from people in chat. This might be a good time to go back to that first question from the poll, just to see what everyone in chat has been thinking about in terms of the accountability and what happens next that we've been talking about. Amien, what do you have?
Right, so the question again was, how should accountability be determined for the student deaths? We had 27,700 and counting. 27,700 and counting. I think that's the most votes we've had on our poll so far.
Yeah.
That's a great sector of our viewership. So in response to that, 15% said that a government probe would be the best way to deal with the student deaths. 26% said a UN-led inquiry would be the best way. 55% is the highest number, so that is the most popular selection. They are calling for new elections. You can also see that reflected in the chat. And then only 4% said there will be no accountability. So not much pessimism. It seems like people believe that there is a way forward here, and most people calling for new elections, as well as a UN-led inquiry. And a lot of people commented that they would want to see both done.
Both. New elections, free and fair elections.
Yes. Dr. Yunus said that, and a lot of the non-residential Bangladeshis believe that he could be the next political leader of Bangladesh. Famously, during 2009, when the caretaker government was in charge of Bangladesh, before Sheikh Hasina got in power through the general elections, there was a caretaker government. And it had jailed both the political leaders, Khaleda Zia and Sheikh Hasina. At that time, the military personnel went to Dr. Yunus and asked him to take charge of Bangladesh. He categorically said no. And he says it in live television as well. He recounts that top military officers were sitting at his home overnight trying to convince him to take charge of Bangladesh. But he said he never wanted governance. He's a simple banker. He wants to help the poor. He never wanted governance. But Biresh pointed out that this government has been just tormenting Dr. Yunus as well. Maybe that changes his mind, maybe, because we really do need good political leaders in Bangladesh, good, educated people, someone that understands the younger population, because 8 million people between the age of 21 and 29 that are jobless right now. And these people are at the prime working age. Yeah. So these educated people feel very disconnected with the government. They need someone who represents them in power, someone who's educated, someone who understands them, someone who would bring in more jobs, bring in more progress, and stop the widespread corruption and try to cure the system one way or the other.
Well, Arafat, my takeaway is that you and your generation are not going away, that this story is far from over. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us, your personal stories with us. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
I just want to sort of speak directly to you guys who've been watching us for the past more than an hour. Thanks so much for your time. And I would imagine that, and I would just guess that you've been spending that time with us because you trust us. And if you do, I would ask you to continue to trust us as we try and bring you this very important story. We are only able to bring you this story not because we create it, but because you reach out to us. You have been reaching out to colleagues like Binish. Please continue to do so. We intend to bring this story to you. We hope that you continue to trust us in the work that we are trying to do to bring a story of our times to you on your screens. We thank you for your trust so far, and we hope that you will continue to trust us moving forward. Thanks so much for joining us today. Remember, we're back again next week with another episode on News Desk. Who knows, maybe we'll talk about Bangladesh then. Yep. But you will know on Tuesday itself what the theme is going to be. That's going to be 24 hours in advance of the actual live stream like this one. Do tune in. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.